lesson has been told from the days of old. And from the dinosaur descriptions in the book of Job. Behold the king of all the beasts on the face of the globe. Pyrotechnically bestowed and ferocious and bold. Stronger than King Kong, his eyes are red like dawn. Greater than Gorg on a kraken, he's Leviathan. The water churns with a violent commotion. Upon inspection, his skills are laid in sections. Overlapping just like armor for defense and protection. He strikes fear and terror in the hearts of men. And if you battle him, you will not forget it. Never attempt to ever touch him again, or you'll regret it. His teeth are terrible, his jaws are very powerful. You cannot penetrate the skin of this animal. You'll never kill him with your slings and stones. Ineffective as straw on your spears and arrows. You cannot bring his nose, fire and steam from nostrils. If you jostle this colossal, then he might get hostile. We believe these proportions describe dinosaurs that lived among men, such as Brontosaurus, favorite as dragons is how they're recorded through time and wrinkle. Just we believe these proportions describe dinosaurs that lived among men, such as Brontosaurus, favorite as dragons is how they're recorded through time and wrinkle. Just power and strength of behemoth, swinging his tail like a cedar log, head above the treetops. A herbivore who eats grass like an ox. He can never be caught. He lives in lakes and locks, among the lotus plants and reasons where this monster rocks. Just another unknown, like the Yeti and Sasquatch. Bones like bronze, he's the chief of the ways of God. No one can threaten him or catch him off guard. Store reliefs of these fabulous beasts, from Hercules to the dragon, chase a battle for the golden fleece. I know it's hard to conceive what ancient peoples believe, but every culture agrees, from the Greek to Chinese. From feathered serpents with wings, the basilisk and the sphinx, the hydra, chimera, and the griffin and banshee. The dragons on the walls of Babylonian gates, plus all the legends round the world about creatures and lakes. Giant squids with the eyes the size of dinner plates. What you think? Do you think they can all be fakes? We believe these proportions describe dinosaurs that lived among men, such as Brontosaurus, favorite as dragons is how they were recorded through time and wrinkle. We believe these proportions describe dinosaurs that lived among men, such as Brontosaurus, favorite as dragons is how they were recorded through time and wrinkle. So take your radiometric decay and your carbon 14 and just put it away. We won't be swayed from the truth by your nonsense. We won't protest and request you change contents, and recognize that you built your claims on pretense, and admit that evolution is a myth of pseudoscience. Some scientists won't admit that being atheist could make them biased when interpreting the evidence. They think we're accidents, their intellect is arrogant. Many dismiss and neglect what is relevant, like the discovery of coelacanth, this living fossil in a fish market, torrent have the fossil record. Inconvenient for the seasoned professionals, like professors and professed intellectuals. Their observations gotta fit prevailing paradigms. A pair of pterodactyls probably went paralyzed, wouldn't believe it if they saw it with their own eyes. Hypnotized like the Holy Bible prophesies. These proportions describe dinosaurs that lived among men, such as Brontosaurus, favorite as dragons is how they were recorded through time and wrinkle. Just these proportions describe dinosaurs that lived among men, such as Brontosaurus, favorite as dragons is how they were recorded through time and wrinkle. Just
Hello guys, welcome. That is the perfect song for this introduction, because I am thrilled to tell you that I have Mr. Gary Wayne, the author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, here on my little channel tonight, my little old channel. And I am so grateful because this man is a wealth of knowledge. Specifically tonight, he's going to teach us, and especially me, about the dragon and the serpent and the Leviathan. So welcome, Gary Wayne. So glad you're here.
Well, thank you for inviting me back, and so very much looking forward to the conversation tonight. So I think it's going to be one of those ones that really sort of opens the eyes of some people, and hopefully if we've if we do our job right, that it's going to, create some curiosity as well. So looking forward to the conversation.
Me too, because I want to know a lot of this stuff. I have your book, and if you guys don't have the book, get it because it's the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. If you do have the book, what I was looking at covering is mostly chapters 81 and 82, but we're going to lead in with chapter 80, and I would appreciate it, Gary, because you know your stuff. Would you mind just like a synopsis of chapter 80 and how you were kind of bringing it around to pointing out how there's just kind of this serpent scenario in so much of this knowledge of the Genesis 6 understanding?
Yeah, chapter 80 is called Ordo Draconis, and it's kind of one of those chapters where I think it's kind of one of the threshold chapters in the book, and I know there's a number of them, but this one really starts to get people to think about how pervasive the serpentine imagery is in our world today, and how it permeates ancient history, and all of those things are still echoing about our literature and our entertainment, and right throughout everything, even today. I mean, even with you have the medical associations with serpentine imageries. And for those who aren't aware of, a dragon and a serpent were considered the same kind of being in prehistory. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit more as the show goes on. But Ordo Draconis is about an organization of bloodlines of royal kings. And they're going to form Ordo Draconis in around 1400. And so it's after the fall of the Knights Templar. It's when many of their bloodline kingships are being pushed off the throne. And they're going to form this organization to do two things. One is to put their bloodlines back on the throne and in power, and to continue the pursuits of Thoth. And by setting off this new pursuits of Thoth through their religion, and then through all of the different organizations and societies that these people are part of, they're going to actually start off the Renaissance. And so it has a huge impact. So these are all royal kings. And these are bloodline kings that go back to take their genealogies back to the Nephilim, into prehistory. So through several different types of bloodlines, and particularly in Central Europe, these are bloodlines that go right back into the pure bloodlines of the Scythians, who, according to occult beliefs, are the ones who escaped from Tartarus and were the Nephilim, or the Titans, or the heroes of the rebellion before the flood. And these are significant Tuatha De Danann bloodlines, or the Tuatha, or the tribe of Danu, Tuatha Danu. They also take their iconology and imagery back. So this is the Sarkaniron, this is the Ordo Draconis, and it's going to go back to serpentine imagery in terms of the bloodlines. And in the bloodlines, you have two major allegories. One is the fairy bloodline, which of course the Tuatha De Danann are part of that sort of Mary mythology, as being the fairy folk and the fair people, and also the dragon bloodlines, and that's the male bloodline. And it's interesting that there's an individual that is called Vlad the Impaler, who is inducted into this organization in about 1439, as I recall, so shortly after the creation of Ordo Draconis. And Vlad is one of those significant pure bloodlines of the Scythian, and some people say the Tamil angelic bloodline, that is now coming into this continental organization. Not that they were ever inferior to it, it's just that they're uniting more of the continental bloodlines, because the Vlad the Impaler's bloodlines is significant, and he's called, Dracula in terms of his title, and Dracul, and Dracula comes from putting the A on, which means the son of a dragon. And it's interesting that the word dragon goes back into Greek as Draconta and a couple of variations, but it means to watch and the watchers. So again, you get all of this imagery that's uniting. And of course, Vlad the Impaler is who Dracula was based on. And Dracula, obviously, is a serpentine individual that drinks blood like Nephilim, and he's got fangs that he has that are actually cobra-like fangs. And, of course, the cobra imagery in Egyptian iconology is front and center in their serpentine imagery of royalty. And just as the Naga, which were the dragon, serpent, angels of the subcontinent of India, that word goes back to Sanskrit as being the word for cobra as opposed to just snake, which is a separate word. So again, you have the linking of all of that serpentine etymology that's involved here. And so this bloodline of Vlad the Impaler is sort of that creation of the imagery of what a modern vampire in Dracula is. Well, sorry, my dog is barking.
That's okay. You're being protected.
I'm just going to close this door so that he can't see out.
He's a protector.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I'm at my cottage, so.
Yep, that's what I forgot.
He's at least a foot tall, so.
Yeah, he's gonna get him. I was thinking that I forgot to tell everybody that's why we're not doing the video, is because you are at your cottage, and so we have audio. But they figured that I also typed that in. So go on, as you were saying, please.
Every once in a while, Riley likes to get his opinion in on things, so that's my dog's name.
Good puppy.
So, yeah. And so Vlad the Impaler is who Dracula is based on, that Bram Stoker wrote about. And they created this imagery from Vlad, who was of these royal bloodlines and drinks blood just like Nephilim used to do. And he was pale-skinned. And this is Vlad we're talking about. And he had hazel green eyes and red hair, just as one branch of the Tuatha De Danann did, which would be the more Irish bloodline, as opposed to the blonde hair and blue-eyed version. And of course, you're going to have red hair with blue eyes as well in that intermix. But those are the two dominant ends of it. And he had this albino type of skin in this condition where he was more of a night person, and an oupier, which will go back to Lilith and vampires as you take those words back into prehistory. And again, Lilith, comes down the female bloodline, just to sort of double tap on that, and represents one of the major dragon queens of the fairy bloodline, and that's why she's also so famous. And so this Ordodrocanus is a retaking of thrones on continental Europe to bring their bloodlines back to power. And they take those bloodlines and their allegories and their mythologies and all of their literature right back to prehistory, into the Nephilim and to the seraphim fallen angels. And so when I talked about Tamil, I could have, we could be talking about Azazel's bloodline, or we could be talking about any of the other rebellious angels who, allegedly started these bloodlines, and they're all watchers and or seraphims. And seraphims are angels that have a serpent face and 6 wings and feathered. And so these are flying serpents, or flying angelic dragons, as we would understand that. And so again, Nagas would represent that. You have, I think, the best example coming out of the Quiché Maya and all Central American cultures, where you have the plumed serpent and you have the also known as the feathered serpent. Those are all gods, and they're all talking about the same class of gods or angel, which are seraphim angels. So it's important to understand how this permeates. And that's, I like that chapter because it sort of transcends, ancient history and into modern history and into the literature and the brainwashing that goes on, because we just accept this imagery and nobody questions it because we're brainwashed to accept it. But if you look at the coats of arms of the royal families, they have their genealogies and things that are encoded and embedded in their coats of arms. So, for example, with the Stuart dynasty, you would have a lion and a unicorn on there. And that represents a lot of what their history is all about. And a unicorn isn't what we understand it from the Bible, even though the King James Version, sponsored by King James Stuart, has unicorn put in as the imagery is we're brainwashed to think is a one-horned horse. That was a Nephilim horse of the antediluvian epoch that Nephilim kings rode on into battle, not the wild bull as Rem is, as it comes out of Hebrew, and it should be translated as a wild bull properly, but that's just some of that overlay of this brainwashing that is out there. You'll also see on a lot of coat of arms dragons, and again, that will indicate significant meaning in terms of what their genealogical bloodlines on. So anything that's in a coat of arms, whether or not it's a seahorse, like on the Tucker clan, or dragons or lions or fleur-de-lis and things like that, that is taciturn language telling you who their bloodlines are, and then offspring houses will have similar types of coats of arms that will have similar type of iconology. So it's a very complicated set of taciturn imagery and communication that these families do, and I'm certainly not versed on everything, but I have a fairly a good understanding directionally as to what they're trying to do. And so that chapter starts to set up chapter 81, which is called Serpents and Dragons, and where we start to go back to the beginning as to where this imagery starts to come from, and then sort of how that kind of unfolds down through prehistory. And then chapter 82 goes into Leviathan, which is really a significant and under analyzed area in terms of what is Leviathan and why is it important. So I'll just leave it there for you to jump in, Abby, because I did a little bit of a rant there on chapter 80.
Yep, and I like it. If anyone wonders why he calls me Abby, that's my Facebook name, and it's fine with me because even my gym instructor wanted to call me that apparently the other day. She's like, I just want to call you Abby because that's all I ever see on Facebook. So that's awesome. Let's see, I did have a question on kind of getting into some of this. We're going to start talking about crocodiles. We're going to start talking about serpents. And as we get into that, I'm going to have some more kind of questions related to the crocodile and its part in some of real history, I believe, as we know it. So I think, if you don't mind, we'll just kind of let you start. When you get into chapter 81, it's called The Serpents and the Dragons. And your very first sentence is the joint legacy of the serpent and the dragon was that of the prehistoric crocodile. It was the most sacred of all creatures in antiquity. And I'm sure, if you don't mind, I'll read the Genesis portion too that you put in this chapter. Okay, so it's Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. So the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and eat dust all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So obviously this is Satan that we're kind of dealing with. But my very first question for you on this, which you'll get into a lot of the specifics, but if you don't mind, was Satan actually the serpent in the garden, or did he possess the serpent in the garden, or what would you say was the process happening with the serpent in the garden? Did I lose you, Gary?
Sorry about that. I had my mute on. The serpent is the individual in Eden that deceives Eve, and then, of course, Adam, and they both eat from the tree of evil, but it's the serpent that is punished. The serpent loses its arms, and the serpent loses its legs, and it loses its speech, and it loses its intelligence. And so it is transformed into a physical being of the field that is different than what it was before, and all aspects and varieties of those animals are changed. So when we look at who deceives Eve, we need to understand that that is the Nakash. That is not Satan. Satan doesn't lose his arms or his legs or his intelligence. He is called a serpent and a dragon because he's partly seraphim angel. But he's not the one that's punished. But I do think that Satan either coaches the Nakash or is the avatar for Nakash, who is the Avatara, as it's understood in occult language. Well, that's the Vishnu with Buddha, and what the New Age will teach about the incarnation of the coming Messiah from their aspect, what we would call Antichrist. Expect that they'll promote an incarnation. And so that's kind of like a symbiotic relationship where an angel will enter a being and will help it do something that it wasn't capable of doing. And the best example we have of that in the Bible would be, again, with Satan and with Judas, as he needs extra help and courage to go through with betraying Jesus, and Satan enters him to do that. So I kind of think that Satan probably does that with the Nakash, although we're not told that, and Satan is not held responsible for it. So I actually think it's the Nakash. So, but whatever somebody wants to come to a conclusion on that, we have this extraordinary, intelligent being that disappears from the face of the earth, and seemingly a favored being of the Watchers and Satan, who is also classified partly as seraphim and as in Revelation 12 a dragon and a serpent. And so makes you wonder what were these beings created? How are they created? What was their purpose? And they have the same sort of symmetry with, I would say, the royal bloodlines, and almost a similar look that would be akin to the crocodile. And I think it's, what's going on here is a linkage back through the crocodile to what maybe some of the Nakash might have looked at. And I say some because some of them may have had wings. That would have been what we would understand in mythology as physical flying animal serpents or dragons. And so there's probably many, many forms. But the royal serpent, or the royal being that would be akin to the crocodile, is likely why the crocodile is so, as it comes down through later prehistory and history, and particularly in Egypt again, why it is portrayed and thought to be a royal type of being, and has royal type of imagery, and just as Sobek is a crocodile god in Egypt mythology. But almost all of the parent gods in ancient Egypt, the Ogdoad gods, had a serpentine look. And if you've never Googled Ogdoad, I would suggest you do it. It's Ogdoad, and in Google ask for some images, and you're going to get some reliefs. And most of these are very much a serpentine, crocodile type of parent god. And that's not unusual, because all of the parent gods were for the most part, described as serpent kind of beings. So whether or not you're dealing with, the original parent gods of Greece with Kronos and Uranus and those parent gods, they were serpentine. Or the serpent gods of the parent class in Sumeria, where you have Anu and Tiamat, who we'll come back and touch on in a second. And all of those were considered serpent gods. And the offspring of these gods, whether or not it's Osiris and or Zeus or Zeus and or Enki or Enlil, using the three pantheons and being consistent, they were depicted as serpents. And so you have the serpentine imagery from the gods. You have the serpentine imagery with the Nakash that was used by Satan and willing to be used by Satan to bring down humans. And you have Nephilim as offspring of the seraphim angels that also had a seraphim serpentine look in their original creation. And if you want to again look at depictions and statues of King Akhenaten, you get this strange looking being that is living in somewhere between 12 and 1400 BC, depending on which chronology you're going to use on his dating. And that's well after the flood, for the recreation of the giants, and a couple thousand years before, since the creation of the original Nephilim before the flood. And yet he still has these high cheekbones, this extended long chin, these eyes that are large and wrap around, and this elongated skull and these thin lips. And he's wearing a headdress that has a cobra hood that has those stripings that go back, and usually colored in blue and white. And usually attached on that headdress is a cobra. And he has this elongated skull on the cap that he's wearing to cover his serpentine head. And so all of this is coming out of prehistory when you understand that the bloodlines of the kings, whether or not it was before the flood or after the flood, were the offspring of these gods. And they were Nephilim and Rephaim, and they had the serpentine look in between. And that's why you have all the serpentine imagery that accompanies royal families even to this day. And that's why you have a common history worldwide of dragon gods, whether or not it's in China, or Naga gods in India, or all the other serpentine gods that I've talked about around the world, who have offspring who become their representatives, and demigods on earth, and who are the ruling class, and who the complete nobility class comes from. And they track those genealogies for their positioning in that cult, and always have done so since the beginning. And for the royal bloodlines and those wanting to move up through the generations, they are continually wanting to intermarry into these bloodlines, to ennoble those bloodlines and move up in position in that sort of cult. So crocodile, linking back in, was, I think, adopted into that sort of royalty, taciturn iconology, because it's the best sort of representative of what an Akash might have looked like before it was punished. And it's thought that the Nakash was the ruling class of being before Adam was created, and that it was, governing the earth. And one presumes then governing at a higher level than what the people of day 6 would have been. But with Adam being created, whose destiny was and is to be, have his descendants be raised higher than fallen angels and resolve the angelic rebellion that took place in prehistory. In the end time, with that resolution, where humans are going to be raised to the level of angels, and probably higher, because we're going to be adopted as sons of God, even though we have human fathers, by Jesus through his sacrifice and atonement. And thus, as Jesus was born a little bit lower and raised higher through his crucifixion and with the word of God, we will be as his brothers, and that has an implication that we're going to be probably higher than the angels in the future time. And we're actually going to judge some of those fallen angels for the crimes that they've done against us right from the beginning. So even though we don't have the Nakash's seed that I think takes place after Eden, but we do get imagery in a prophecy in Genesis 3:15 of a serpent seed that will be at odds with Eve's offspring. I think that's actually fulfilled in Genesis 6 with the serpentine Nephilim. And just so that people understand, there are other different looking gods. There are like lion gods, and there's jackal gods, and there's a few other ones. And you know, they likely produced Nephilim that look just like them as well. So if you're wondering about dog Nephilim or jackal Nephilim or lion Nephilim or bird Nephilim like the Anunnaki would have looked like, they weren't seemingly created in the same kinds of numbers or as the dominant ruling class, but that's because the seraphim were the watchers. The seraphim are the priests, as Isaiah 6 talks about, that work in the altar before God with the stones, the fiery stones, and they actually take the sins away from Isaiah when he's brought up there in Isaiah 6, because they're serving at the altar. So they run the religions, and that's why you have so much serpentine imagery in the religions. And in Daniel 4, where you get watchers mentioned 3 times, these are the ones that come from God for governance. And again, these are the seraphim angels, and which is why first Enoch talks about the watchers who are governing the antediluvian world. And just so that people are clear, even though many of these angels went to the abyss, there are other fallen angels that have stepped up to rule continuously through the council of the gods and through the 70 nations. So that's in Deuteronomy 32 and Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82 that I'm referencing here in terms of the chapters for the ruling gods. And Satan is still the king and the prince of this world, the god of this world. So we need to understand that they have had and continue to have this effect, which also answers as to why they're able to keep their offspring in power and the imagery front and center and the brainwashing in place. So
I have a
again,
question.
I think I've probably covered a lot of ground, so you probably have a few questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Did crocodiles always have 4 legs then, or when you described that they, you know, specifically with the serpent being 2 legs before? I was just curious, and my friend Ben's, as you probably seen him in chats maybe before, but we were talking about the crocodiles and their role, and was this something that you think always had 4 legs, or did they have 2 legs previously too?
Well, I think we have to take serious that if the occult believes that the crocodiles were part of this sort of Nakash type of being, that they may have walked up on two legs as well, just as Sobek would have, right? And there could have been another kind of Nephilim like that. So I think we have to be open to that possibility that this is a different format and maybe a partially punished format, so that it's not, because it's not an intelligent being either. So either that was before the flood that imagery goes back to, which is probably more likely, but there would have been a being like that. But again, that would have been part of the corruption, whether it's before or after the flood. But when the earth was corrupted and you had all of these original beings being created before the flood, that's part of what was going on in the antediluvian world. And corrupt is far greater than, you know, the terminology of violence as we understand why the flood came about. I mean, it says the whole world was corrupted. That's the Hebrew word chikath, and I mean, it means totally disfigured, decayed, destroyed. So the whole world was. That means plants and animals. And I think that all derived from the fallen angels as they were changing the DNA and the genomes of everything in the antediluvian world, and why God called the animals to the ark, because he knew which ones were not corrupted and would be good representatives going forward.
Okay, and Eric in the chat asked, are there good archaeological digs of the bones of some of these creatures that we have seen? I mean, I know there's elongated skulls that we found. Well, I'm talking about the human archaeologist or whatever that people have found. Would, what do you know about the archaeological digs and finds of some of these creatures?
Are we talking about Nakash, or are we talking about Nephilim?
Well, I
Probably
think some of
Nephilim is
these,
what he's referring to.
or even some of these more serpentine creatures, since that's been basically our topic, like maybe dragons or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we get, first of all, I mean, when we look at the word dinosaur, that word only comes about, a couple hundred years ago. And before that, they were called dragons. So when we look at the dinosaur, the saurian beings, these are reptilian beings. And a lot of them, as we're learning now, have feathers. And they seem to be beings that would be considered giants as well, and seemingly would be a prize being of would have a similar look, and anything reptilian would be part of their favored beings, as opposed to primates and or humans, and so or mammals. So they would have a preference to these type of beings. So when we're digging up or mammals, so they would have a preference to these type of beings. So when we're digging up a lot of these different kinds of so-called dinosaurs, some of them, they're probably should be called dragons, physical world dragons, as opposed to the spiritual or dragons. And I think they're all in that sort of class of beasts and or animals that have gone extinct, whether or not they went extinct just before the flood in that time period, or someone might be a proponent of the gap theory, where you've got even older dates for these beings, and probably has a better fit for the angelic rebellion fitting there. But I'm fine either way in terms of that chronology. But these dinosaur bones, I mean, those are going to be a lot of those creatures. Now, if we're talking about intelligent beings, that would be either created through sexual copulation or some or other sort of chimera type of creation that would still have intelligence, that were created by the fallen angels. We don't have a lot on that. We get some diggings in terms of odd archaeology for lion Nephilim, and we get certainly all of these elongated skulls, these giant bones that have been discovered for thousands of years, and then there's a strong track record or documentation of those discoveries even in North America through the newspapers that run from about 1850 to about 1950. And there's people want a link, get a hold of me through my website and my email address, and I'll send you the link where you can pull up these archaeological finds where they either went directly to the Smithsonian or went to a university or to a local school or something, and then to the Smithsonian, and they disappear. Just as strangely, you have the Vatican, who does the same thing, where they're hunting these artifacts down. There are artifacts in throughout the Mediterranean where they have these elongated skulls and some of these bones. They just don't put them out on display to this day. So there's a strong history of finding these reptilian type creatures from the intelligent side, and there's a strong tradition where you're getting this brainwashing and this meshing of these dragon creatures in with the dinosaurs, which are also reptilian. So there's a lot of cover up that's going on out there in terms of misrepresenting what these finds are.
Okay, I have another question. So, if you look at mud fossils, and that people think that these creatures were even far, 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 far larger than even the dinosaurs that we find. Some people even believe that the mountains were. So, if anyone doesn't know what mud fossils are, it's the creation of Earth. I'm not saying the Earth, not the creation of the Earth, but the creation of some of our Earth by giants or maybe large fish or dragons. And you can look at someone like Roger from Mud Fossils University, who I'm not necessarily recommending as a good resource, but he's one that he might be. Forget it. He might be great, but he's got also a leftist viewpoint, so just beware, use discernment. But he talks about these creatures that have created just portions of the earth, if not most of it, with their enormous bodies. What would you say about the possibilities of that?
Well, I think there's a significant possibility of these giant creatures. So there was a lot of corruption that was going on and very little written record. But what we do know the whole world was corrupt. And again, we don't know which period that those would have been created in. So you could have had, again, a whole world of these things that were created by fallen angels before the earth was destroyed and then renewed, as Psalm 104:30 would suggest. So I think that's entirely possible. But I think people get a little bit too far out over their skis in projecting of the extent of how many beings and when these beings were in terms of the size. And so you have the giant trees and you have these giant sort of beings. I think there's a famous discovery that a lot of people look at in northern Africa that looks like it might be Leviathan-like size, that seems to have that sort of fossilized structure in the middle of a desert. You have to remember there was two Leviathan that was created. One was destroyed in prehistory by God, and it was a multi-headed hydra, as we're told it as having in Psalm 74:14. And God broke the heads of the Leviathan and killed it, but there's still one more that is out there, if that were possible. And seemingly it is, because Isaiah 27 talks about killing the other Leviathan in the end time, and this Leviathan, allegorically at least, has a lot of relationships with Satan as well. So, but I'm just using that as an example that the Bible gives us of this huge monster. And I write in my book that it's not out of the Bible, it's actually from somebody collecting the different mythologies, that they think it was as big as 900 miles long. I think that's probably an exaggeration, but it would be absolutely monstrous. But Leviathan has this prehistory association in the occult where you have a male and a female, and it was the female in all accounts that were killed that were producing the cosmic egg for the renewal of the earth. And to me, that is quite an interesting coincidence, where you have that as a worldwide mythology or legacy or history, and that it has a connection to the Bible. And so we don't know whether or not these Leviathans were used by God to help make some creation, or it's the occult taking the Leviathan story to a whole different level of mythology. But the stories are extraordinarily similar. And you have, in different cultures, so you have like Baal in the Canaan dynasty, or Canaan culture, he kills a Leviathan type creature in the same way as God does, and that Leviathan creature is called Yam. In the Sumerian uh, mythology, you have Marduk who kills Tiamat, and also Baal in the Rosh Shamra account kills Lotan, which is I think the same as Yam, just probably just a different name from a different legend. You have Yu in Chinese mythology killing this dragon. You have Indra in the Indian religion and mythology killing Verta, or Ahi as it's also known as. You've got in the Norse mythology, you've got Thor that kills the Midgard dragon. And you have, these two Leviathan creatures that are called Tepu and Gukamats in the Akisha Maya and the Miztec accounts. You've got Ra in the Egyptian account who kills Apep or Apophis. And in Manichaeism, they actually have the offspring of Shemyaza or Azazel, which is Haya and Oya, that kill the Leviathan. And so this is a common understanding of this size of creature that's around the world, and it's recorded in the Bible. So is there a possibility that they were that size? Absolutely there were. How many of them? Probably not that many, because creatures of that size would just absolutely eat the resources of the world. So you can't have enough resources and plant size to make that work on a world this size. You just start to lose the logistics of that. That doesn't mean that there weren't giant trees, because there probably were, and I know that's part of the mud fossils research as well. And again, I think there were probably genomes changed in some of the trees that created these giant trees in the antediluvian world. So, but I think we can't get too far, like I said, over our skis and in front of what we actually know and make extrapolations that we can't really support. So I would say that they would have been few and not that many.
So, just to clarify, a dragon having its head as big as Africa itself, probably not likely in your research?
Probably not likely. I don't know how it could continue to get enough nourishment.
Okay, that's how I feel too. But it was a question that we came. When I say we, I get to come together with my buddies in my Discord channel ahead of time, and they help me
Yeah.
think of smarter questions. But that was one, because the one thing that Mud
Yeah.
Fossils likes to do is turn Africa sideways and show how, look, this is a dragon's head, or I mean, and just enormous things that they say were beings. And while I I look at it and I go, okay, maybe it just starts to get to a point where it's like, well, now they're trying to say all of our earthly dirt and rocks and mountains and even everything is now made from some kind of giant. And anyway, I think you could kind of pendulum swing back and forth on that one and find a middle ground. So just to bring us back to the serpents and the dragon, in chapter 31, you talk about the pre-Eden, before, obviously before Eden, but you also say that they were still intelligent before the flood, and that there would have been an intelligent creature. Was it after or was it, am I wrong? Was it after Eden that they lost their intelligence, or would it be after the flood? If you don't
Yes,
mind clarifying.
after Eden.
Okay.
Yeah, right after Eden is what we're told. I think the Bible reads linear, and that happens, in chapter 3. So I think it happens at that time. But again, it's that odd prophecy. What is the serpent seed? And there's, different schools of thought. Some people think that that Satan had actually had sex with Eve in Eden and created the Canaanite bloodline. That's the serpent seed. And but I think it's more like it's the serpentine offspring of the ruling angels of that time, which was the seraphim watchers and the sons of God of Genesis 6. And then I think they recreated those Nephilim after the flood. But I do recognize that maybe some of them survived. And I think we have to be open to the fact that everything on the earth was killed, but that doesn't necessarily say that anything that was off the Earth or taken off the Earth or hid in the Earth may have survived somehow. So we have to be a little bit open-minded on that. Even though my favorite position is only the 8 survived, and then you have a second incursion. We don't have absolute scripture that nullifies the other points of view. So
I think that Star Trek is very interesting. How they also have a whole they have a whole bunch of series on this character Q, which I think we could compare to QAnon currently. But you also mentioned in Star Trek's Voyager that there's an account of ancient intelligent superior race of Saurians. And I want to, in case anybody else is like me, I wasn't sure what Saurian meant for the people listening. Saurians. That you say a superior race of Saurians that evolved from dinosaurs and had originally dominated the Earth before the age of humans. What is Saurian? And you say in this book, you kind of, I don't know if we talked about it yet. If we did, forgive me, but that they actually ruled the Earth before we came here. Hello? Did I lose you, Gary? Or are you muted again?
I was taking care of Riley there. Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
So let's talk a little bit about the Star Trek series just for a second. So what they did a couple shows on this, and what I think is important to understand in terms of how they mix that in is that, first of all, Star Trek Voyager is in a different section of space, and they come across this set of beings, and they are intelligent dinosaurs. And so when you look at what they're talking about, and as they start to talk about their history in that show, is that there was a destruction of the Earth. So just as they like to teach in science, where there was this asteroid attack and it was a cataclysmic event, they were that advanced that they saw this coming, and then they left. And so Star Trek Voyager comes along. So what you find in entertainment is that they like to keep their beliefs. The occult likes to keep their beliefs alive, and so science fiction is one of those genres that depicts a lot of their beliefs, whether or not it's their religion, their view of the world. So to me, it wasn't very surprising to have Star Trek, do a series or do a show that was on these soaring beings that actually survived, and that they would have lived in an age and a time frame that was well before the flood and well before that. So back into the gap sort of theory in terms of timing, and that these beings, seemed to be very similar, although they weren't quite as big, to what the Nakash would have been looking like. So. And so if people don't know what the word saurian means, I mean, it really just means a large reptile. And, and they've attached a prefix on there for dinosaurs. So, but that's what I mean by a saurian being. It's anything that is, a large, extinct sort of reptilian being.
Okay. Well, let me go to my next. Hold on. I'm organizing my brain. Forgive me, everybody. So, okay, you explained the Saurian. Ben's wanted me to ask you. He's from the chat, and I don't know where he wants to go with this, so he's going to need to clarify later. But he did want to ask if you've seen Stargate SG-1, and if you have, if you already know how that connects somehow, and if not, we'll move on until he tells us what he meant.
Well, and what they do in Stargate is a little bit different twist. I mean, again, it's on the alien mythos that is combining a serpentine type of imagery, and so you've got these stargates, which are basically wormholes to different parts of the galaxy, and they run into all of these different kinds of aliens that are out there. And one of them is the Goa'uld, and the Goa'uld is this small serpentine type of being that takes over the host. And it's like an allegory of a serpentine being demon possessing, because it suppresses the host, right? And these Goa'uld, small serpent parasite type beings, they are very, very intelligent beings, and they take over the humans and possess technology and power and become the gods of ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and ancient India, and they enslave humankind. So all that it's basically saying is there's a different type of serpent seed that is in these ancient demigods that were enslaving humankind and using their knowledge and their technology to do that. And they would, basically, persecute, slaughter, and enslave humans for their own purposes. So, again, anything in entertainment, particularly science fiction, understand that they're talking about parts of their history within some of the allegories. So they're teaching people about these old gods through some very interesting entertainment. And as you move through that series, and particularly in the Stargate Atlantis, but before you get there, I mean, you find out the ancients are the Atlanteans. And these ones are ones that have transcended into another consciousness, which is what the demigods want to do in terms of having a universal religion and a universal government that they can vibrate into godhood and ascend. And so again, all they're doing is encoding their belief system and their history and what they'd like to do in the future into the entertainment.
In the book on page 571, you talk about the Lord of the Rings memorializing these forgotten ancient epics. This might seem a little bit off topic, but it's not, because you did mention it in this chapter. Do you think Lord of the Rings was trying to show us this in a positive Christian way, or do you think Lord of the Rings was just kind of doing what other entertainment does, is giving us the truth, but not exactly the way we would understand it?
Yeah, it's written for the adepts in the occult to understand everything. And so this is talking about the antediluvian age, the Lord of the Rings, and you have all of these different types of creatures and beings, whether or not they're fairies. And when I talk about fairies in there, there's different groups of the fairy people. So typically you've got the famous ones in Lord of the Rings are the Hobbit and the dwarves, and those are the ugly ones, that in the elemental group and in with the gnomes. And then they've got these other elves are the noble white elves. Those are typically an allegory for a Nephilim creature. They don't show them in that same size, but this is the noble Celt. This is the noble Tuatha De Danann. This is the noble fairy people, and they have that pale white skin. But they would have been known as being larger. They're the Tuatha De Danann. They're the fairy people. And you also have, the dwarves, which were, lived in mountains and holes. And what they did is they made weaponry and things for the Nephilim. And at the end of the story, you have all of these different types of creatures and things that are sailing away on the boat. And they say it's because this is the time of humans now, and they have to go away for a while. And so that's an allegory of the flood. But what they're also saying is not all of them were survived. There were survivors on another ark or another boat that was taken somewhere else and survived. And so that's how you have this fairy mythos of the little people that continue, even with the gnomes, who are the ones who would have kept the genealogies and the technology, which have a gray neighbor or a gray fairy who has flying machines and great technology, and they kidnap people and they come through fairy portals and into this world and kidnap people and do all sorts of other things, and they look and sound just like the Greys out of the alien mythos. And also, I mentioned that there's the ugly ones, and that's who the gnomes are part of. You also have the mischievous ones like leprechauns, and you also have, the good-looking ones. And what's really interesting about that is that there's another leg, I guess, or grouping of the fairies, somehow distinct but related, but higher than these beings, because these elementals, and we do get elementals and rudiments in the Bible, so there's a basis for this that we can get from the Bible in terms of these beings that are ruling this world and helping with all of the vain philosophies to drive humans away from God. You also have a fourth group that are reptilian, and they're called salamanders, but they're higher in the hierarchy than the elementals. Noting that the elementals are at the bottom of that whole hierarchy of angels and demons. And so the salamanders seem to be this reptilian class, or part of the reptilian class of the aliens that you get in that alien mythos. And then I also wonder whether or not Nakash, they might have survived or been helped survive by the fallen angels, and maybe they're part of that whole alien mythos. And then again, I wonder, and I'm just speculating, are we going to see these things, come forward, in the end time? So, with the alien deception that is seemingly coming our way.
Yes, and it's coming out for more and more every day. And there was even a guy I made a news clip. Well, he made the news clip, but I made a little 1-minute clip of him talking about how our programming isn't good enough yet, because he had the other news gal pushing back, saying no one's just gonna, no one is afraid of that aliens are about to land. And he's like, because he was trying to compare a situation to that, and he's like, well, what if aliens land tomorrow and they walk up a ship? She's like, well, that's not going. Nobody's afraid that that's going to happen. And he's like, well, that's right. It just shows you that our programming isn't where it's supposed to be. And I slowed it down on that, where he's like, programming, like they say it right to our faces and in front of us. A question that we had for you is, so you wrote that Osiris was celebrated as a serpent king of the sea. Was Osiris serpent or a merman or crocodile or some kind, or was he just of the bloodline of the serpentine bloodline?
Well, he is the offspring of the parent gods, as Isis is. And you get that sort of similar organizational structure all around the world. So just a couple quick examples to underline what I'm talking about is that you have Anu and Tiamat that are part of the parent gods and serpentine figures. And then you have Anki and Enlil, who are also serpent gods, but they're the offspring of the parent gods. So whether or not that's actually true or not, that they actually produced between themselves lower gods, and then the lower gods like Zeus and Poseidon, who are the offspring of like Kronos and Uranus as one example. And again, those Greek gods originally portrayed as serpent gods, just as the parent gods are serpent gods in Greek mythology. So whether or not they're actually producing a lower type of god, or these are just sort of the organizational structure that they had in prehistory, these were not the demigods, is what I'm saying. These were still a full-fledged god, just as Baal is the offspring of the Canaanite god, parent god El. And so you have this as a constant around the world. So only when these second-tier gods and some of the parent gods, like Iapetus, for example, out of Greek mythology, take a human female to produce a hybrid human angelic being, do you get the demigods, which are created. So in Egyptian history, you have different eras. You have the reign of the gods, and then you have the reign of the demigods, and then you have the reign of the human pharaohs. And so you get a transition. So at a certain point in time in the antediluvian world, and it is recreated again after the flood with the Rephaim and the Egyptian kings in what we're talking about. And of course, Akhenaten would come out of that. That would be the Nephilim kings that are ruling, or the Rephaim kings, and or before the flood, the Nephilim kings. So that's where they would have a serpentine type being, but they would now be, as we understand it, part of that physical world. Whereas the gods would be a spirit being that can take a physical form.
Okay. I have a question about Cain, and who did Cain, do we know about Cain, since Cain has a bloodline, did we know who his wife was, or wives?
We do not. That is a mystery. And so that's why I think that Adam is a different creation than the people of day 6. And that you get this time frame between day 6 and Adam that was likely, after day 7, as you sort of look at Genesis in a linear fashion. So after day 7, after the Sabbath, and then likely on day 8, you get Adam created for a different commission than the people of day 6. And as the book of Peter talks about, if a day is like 1,000 years, and you apply that to the 6 days of creation and the Sabbath, you have at least 1,000 years or more there when Adam is created. And so I think it's likely that Cain takes a wife from the people of day 6. So Eden is in the Mesopotamia or Sumer area based on the rivers. It has Tigris and Euphrates that are coming out of that. And then Cain goes east of Eden to the city of Nod, and he takes a wife immediately there. We're not told where. And he builds a city. We're not told for whom. And he produces Enoch, who he names this city afterwards, all of which doesn't make any sense. And the usual story is that, well, he took a wife from Adam and Eve's offspring. Well, but the timeline doesn't really sort of match up. So the ostracization of Cain and the murder of Abel and the first offerings seems to suggest that those would be the first harvests and produce of Cain and Abel, and Cain wouldn't have offered the first of the bounty, and that's why his offering was not acceptable in terms of how I understand the reasoning for why Cain's offering wasn't acceptable, whereas Abel did. And then so that's why Cain is to leave. So they would have been quite young. And the reason why I'm underlining that is because you don't have Seth born until Adam is 130. And it doesn't appear that Adam and Eve were all that long in the Garden of Eden. And so I don't know whether Cain leaves when he's 20 or he's 40 or he's 50, but Adam is 130 years old. There's a gap in there, and there's no siblings. And then sometime after that, Adam and Eve produced other siblings. So the timeline and the chronology and the wording that the Genesis 4 account produces is unusual, to have it that that offspring would come from Adam and Eve that Cain would have married. So I look for things that don't put the Bible in conflict, because I just don't believe it isn't conflict. I think we get additional information. We just need to understand it that way. And that and a whole bunch of things that just are not consistent with the days 4 through 6 account and the Eden account don't add up. They're not the same. And they would have to be the same story, or they're two different stories. So if for them to be the same story, the details would have to be the same. You have a different creation process in the Eden account. You have male and female being produced in numbers and told to multiply and produce and to be able to eat from any tree and anything of the world, except in the Eden account, Eve is created sometime afterwards. They're not created at the same time, and they can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so there's just too many things. And again, I have a sort of a blow-by-blow document for people on that if they want to get a hold of me to know what the differences are between the days 4 through 6 and the Eden account are. It just doesn't add up. So I think the way that the Bible comes through and isn't in contradiction is just let it tell its own story. And that means then that the wife of Cain came from somewhere else, and that would have been the people of day 6.
Oh, you're teaching me so much, and my brain is filling up. But it's good. This is not a bad thing, not a complaint. So, okay, before we get away from the serpent, the dragon, and the Leviathan, if you would please do me the favor of revisiting. I know you mentioned, you already answered my question, were they a real creature? Because you said yes, but there probably weren't many of them. But if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to read real quick Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1 that you have in here in chapter 82 of the Leviathan. By the way, everybody, if you have a lot of questions, this is coming from the book that he wrote called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy Theory that you can get. We put the website in the chat many times. In fact, I need to just pin it at the top. So that you get the whole book, and you can get a signed copy from the website, which I should have done, darn it. Okay, so Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1. In that day the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword, Leviathan, the gliding serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. And you say Leviathan is an allegory for Satan, a dragon, a gliding serpent, the red dragon, excuse my voice, the red dragon and serpent of Revelation, and possibly the furious horned red dragon known as Masuso in Mesopotamia. And of course it goes on. Do you mind just giving us an overall understanding of Leviathan as the actual creature and the allegory for Satan in Revelation? And are we back? Can you hear me, Gary?
Oh, I'm having a bad night with that mute button, aren't I? So
That's okay.
we're told in Isaiah 27 that God is going to slay Leviathan in the end time. And if we look at, and I used a modern English translation in the book, but if we look at the King James version on that, because you can take those words back to Hebrew and Greek, it says it's a piercing serpent, and piercing, is the Hebrew word bariach, and that means a fugitive serpent, or a noble serpent, or a crooked serpent, or a fleeing serpent. And then it also talks about a crooked serpent, which is twisted and wrong and distorted, for the other description of it. And this sounds a lot like Revelation 12, and how Satan is going to be thrown into the abyss, and then 1,000 years later he's going to go to the lake of fire. And it has imagery of the beast kingdoms, and understanding the word dragon goes back to the word Tannim, which is this sea serpent type individual, just as Leviathan is a reef animal or a sea monster. So dragon, and when you get that word tanum being extended out of Hebrew for the same type of meaning as Leviathan, is something to keep an eye out if you're reading the King James Version Bible. And it's important to understand that, because this creature of the sea that has many heads that God crushes, and that comes out of Psalm 74. That's a hydra. And in prophecy, we get the beast kingdoms, the Tanum kingdoms, the dragon kingdoms. These are the ruling kingdoms of the Rephaim after the flood, and the Nephilim before that. These are the bloodlines. This is the Hydra monster that comes up out of the sea. This is the seven-headed monster that Babylon rides as the universal religion. Babylon coming from Babel, which is that religion that has roots in before the flood, that restarts at Babel with a Nephilim-like character and an Antichrist figure with Nimrod. And so this is a hydra of beasts of seven empires, and those empires are known, and we're told in Daniel 2, and Daniel 7, and Daniel 8 about these empires. And in Daniel 7, you have them as actual beasts, and they're the metallic empires of Daniel 2, and they're the same empires, although Daniel 8 has additional information that works in perfect harmony, in my opinion. So you have Babylon, and you have Persia after that, and you have Greece, and then you have Rome. Those are the old empires. And then the end time empire is a revived Roman Empire that is this 10 king empire that extends out of these beast empires of Revelation 13 and 17, which is a hydra, dragon, serpent coming out of the sea. These are the empires of the seraphim angels and the serpent, who is king over all of the seraphim and over the earth, Satan. And when we look at the imagery of the end time empire, it takes that imagery from those beasts. And Daniel 8 has 5 kingdoms that it's mentioning with Alexander, and Alexander sets up his empire, so that's the Greek Empire. Then it splits into 4 sections, and Rome is one of those 4. So Rome succeeds Alexander, then the 4, and then you have Rome is 5, or I'm sorry, you have 5 plus Rome taking over is 6, and then you have the end time empire, and that's 7, and that is the 7 empires that Babylon is riding. So all that's being told in Daniel 8 is that we may want to look for Antichrist coming out of those beast empires, and likely in this region of the Greek and the Roman Empire. So it gives us some important information. So when Antichrist sets up his kingdom, he is going to be of the bloodlines of these Nephilim kings, these serpent kings, these Rephaim and Nephilim, as I document throughout my book. And he's going to set up an empire that is going to overthrow Babylon at the midpoint of the last 7 years. And he's going to honor a god of forces, who I think is Azazel, a god of the military. And Azazel was the one who taught, according to First Enoch, the art of war, the art of martial arts, and the technology to build weapons to humankind and to the Nephilim in the antediluvian epoch. He is the destroyer god and the god of forces that Antichrist honors as he rises to power, as Daniel likes to talk about. And this empire is also this Antichrist is also going to receive power from Satan and set up the 8th empire that comes out of this Hydra empires. And they're going to worship Antichrist and Satan. And this is the empire that's going to be destroyed in the end time. So I think Isaiah 27 is one of those dual prophecies that I like to do series on and commentaries on Facebook on, that is talking not only about a killing of the male Leviathan that would still be alive, because only the female was killed that we're aware of, and Isaiah 27:1 is talking about killing this this Leviathan. And I also think it's slaying the allegorical, or the allegory that's used for the beast empires, that is so important to understand as we're trying to figure out who and what the end time empire is and all about.
Okay. I think if you don't mind, since we've got 40 minutes, I assume you have 40 minutes. That's generally kind of how we do, is the 2-hour deal. Since we have 40 minutes, would you mind some off-topic questions that people have been asking and had asked previously? How does that sound?
Yep, take as many questions as there are out there.
And they're not even off topic, it's all related. It's the great thing is as you talk about this, these questions really relate one way or another to everything that you talk about, which is not only fun for us. By the way, there was somebody, I think it was What the Heck said in the chat, I love learning, and I will agree with you. This is so fun for us. This is where people, we remind them not to be scared, but to be prepared. That this is also not salvational, most of this stuff, that it's good information, that you've done massive amounts of great research. In fact, guys, get the book, because he goes through so many different other ways to verify his conclusions that are accurate. They're not made up. It's so good. I mean, just amazing. And like you said once before, I mean, your book would have been 1,500 pages or something, but you had to cut it down because they thought it wouldn't sell or something. I don't remember how you said it, but it definitely had to. You felt that you would cut it back a little bit, but really it could be much a larger book, couldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. So I took out 350 pages to get it down to a size that, where they could price it at, that, it wouldn't be into too small of a market, because you get past, a certain price in books, and you really start to limit your market size. I also wanted to, just give a few descriptions that most people, are probably aware of. But, in Job, it gives us some descriptions of what this Leviathan animal looked like. It has rows of scales that are tightly knitted together. So this was, a row of scales that, weapons couldn't penetrate. And so it's probably why it had to be attacked on the head to be destroyed. This is Job 41, and in verse 18, it describes it snorting flashes of light, and its eyes are like rays of the morning or the dawn, so shining bright eyes. Fire streams from its mouth, which is the root of the sort of fire-breathing dragon that's applied to a physical world being, and or an allegory for poison, depending on how you want to look at it. But clearly, Job is describing a fire-breathing Leviathan. So, and smoke comes from its nostrils, and it can set coal ablaze with its breath. So that's the fire coming out, and it can eat iron like straw. So as you read through, through chapter 27 a little bit further, you get an understanding that this is not a creature you want to mess with, and only God, or as in the pantheon of gods, would have one of their chief gods of the lower level would have the ability to destroy, and it's an ancient being. So just wanted to put that in there.
Yeah, thank you for doing that, because there's other scripture that you mentioned throughout these chapters that again brings it back to exactly what we're describing and what you're describing, and why you can describe it the way that you do in your knowledge. So one of the questions that we had ahead of time is from my friend Rockman. And he says, do you think there is currently seeded programming to make it seem like prophecy is occurring? And I think what he meant, which if he didn't, I apologize, Rockman, he's not here, but I was wondering, could that mean that there's a false Armageddon push right now that you see, or do you think this is true prophecy?
Yeah, what we're seeing right now is a lot of misinformation that's out there, and it's designed to deceive and then disillusion people. So I mean, and there's two ways that it sort of happens. One is you have the occult forces who are trying to bring about the end time before the ordained time, because they would love to prove that God wasn't omnipotent and all-knowing. So they're trying to bring it on, but until the restrainer is removed, it's going to happen on the ordained time. But they're trying to discredit and deceive and prepare people for the deceptions that are coming, and trying to get people continually out too far in advance of prophecy and the chronology that's been provided. So everybody wants to jump into the seal openings, and then everybody wants to jump even beyond the seal openings and then into the trumpets. And we can't get ahead of all the events that the Bible talks about that happen at the same time have to be in place to make that happen. I think there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of deception that's going on, and all it's going to do is disappoint people, and then they won't be ready when things really hit, because when it starts to pick up pace, it picks up a pace that we can't believe or understand, and we're starting to see some of it. I do believe we're in the fig tree generation, but we don't know whether or not the fig tree generation is 70 years or 120 years, as Genesis 6 has a lifetime as opposed to the Psalms. And I think the fig tree generation probably starts in Jerusalem, because so much prophecy depends on Jerusalem being in the hands of the southern kingdom, which are the visible people of Judah, even though not all of the Jewish people might be, Judah. So there could be some imposters in there, but we know there's a remnant, and they need to be in Jerusalem at that time. But there's a lot of things yet to be fulfilled. So and I think Jesus lays down the chronology perfectly in his orations in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 17 and 21, and that we're in the birth pangs of the fig tree generation, and those birth pangs are just starting to ping in a way that is getting more intense. And those birth pangs are earthquakes, pestilence, famine, and war. And they all have to work together, so that by the time of the opening of the seals, those birth pang intensities will grow to such an amount that 25% of the world will be destroyed in terms of population and land and animals in the sea at the opening of the seals. And the trumpets are 33%, and the RAFFLES would be 100%, except Jesus shortens the day so that everybody won't be killed. And so even the earthquake is of such large proportions in Revelation 6 that people are running for cover and hiding in the mountains and in holes and things, because they think the day of the Lord is coming, but it's not yet. And Jesus was quite clear. You'll see these things, but knowing the end is not yet. And then he goes through what happens in the first 3.5 years, and then the next 3.5 years, with the middle point being the abomination. And for the last 7 years to start, Daniel 9:27, Daniel 9:26 clearly sets that up as the end, as in, you take that back to Hebrew, the end time, with the covenant that Antichrist is going to negotiate for Babylon. So we don't have Babylon yet. We don't have the universal religion. It's that universal religion which permits the New World Order, the 10-king empire, that Antichrist negotiates. So we don't have that yet. And we don't have the people of Judah being permitted to start the sacrifices on a wing of the temple in Jerusalem. And I don't foresee that the people of Islam are going to permit that without some significant changes like Babylon catastrophes and these birth pangs permitting Babylon to come along and to bring along their false prophets and then bring about the last 7 years with the covenant. So we're just starting to get into that, and I think COVID is part of those birth pangs, but it's just the start.
So you brought up the 10 Kings, which is great because my friend Hubu Jones in the chat, which is actually a female, she asks, will the 10 Kings be humans, or I added to this, will they be countries? What do you believe the 10 Kings will look like?
Well, they're a little bit of both. So we have to understand that this is a worldwide government. So they're going to be regions. And just as they like to call it the New Atlantis, the occult forces that are trying to bring this about, Atlantis had 10 empires, 10 kings that were ruling over vast territories. And they were trying to take over the whole world, as is described in Timaeus and Critias by Plato. So this is the New Atlantis that they're trying to build. And what's interesting is that the Club of Rome, which was created in the late 60s and started to gain momentum in the early 70s, they have assigned the world into 10 regions. So look for 10 trading blocks, 10 spheres of influence, 10 groups of nations that are going to be coming together that will send one representative to this World Council of 10 Kings that is working with Babylon, and Babylon will control them for the first 3.5 years until they partner with Antichrist to overthrow Babylon. So yes, there will be 10 regions, and there will be also 10 kings. Now what's interesting is are they humans? Are they descendants of the Nephilim? Or are there some true Nephilim that's involved? Because when we read Daniel 2:43, that's in the metallic kingdoms, and we get into the end time empire, and the kings of this 10 king empire is that they are going to mix their seed with humans. That's a very odd statement in the King James Version Bible. And I can only take from that is that either this is going to be made up of newly created Nephilim not survived, as well as hybrid descendants who are mixing with humans, or perhaps there will be some non-bloodline strongmen that are in place that are ruling some of these regions of the world. There are 10 toes, and they're split onto 2 different legs, so we don't know how many will be either descendants of the Nephilim or actually true Nephilim. And we don't know where the technology is going today in terms of cloning, and will they create a clone body for some of these demons that can perhaps be the kings of the 10 king empire of the end time. All things we have to wait to see that's going to unfold, and so we don't want to get too stuck in one sort of line of thought. But what we do know is Daniel 2:43 is telling us there's something different involved with humans in the end time with these 10 kings, because they're going to mix their seed with humans. So I think we need to be careful with that. But at a minimum, you have the bloodline descendants trying to bring this about. So they're working with their gods and the demons to bring this about. So there could be a mix, or it could be just bloodline Nephilim descendants that are for the most part going to be the kings, and then you would have human non-bloodline strongmen. So you'll have to wait and see how that turns out.
Okay, so question about from Martin: did the Nephilim build Stonehenge?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think they might have played a hand in it. I think, though, that I like the account that the Freemasons and the Gnostics have on it. So what they think, and this comes from Knight and Lomas, as I believe, Mason historians, that Enoch, son of Cain, who I write extensively about in the book, as working with the fallen angels and receiving illicit knowledge and developing the 7 sacred sciences, he travels the world according to their accounts and helps build these megaliths, and at least lends the technology to build Stonehenge in particular, and the pyramids in particular. And they talk about other ones too, don't really name them, but that he was a worldwide traveler. We don't know, how long Enoch was doing this for, but we do know that he lived to be a long age, and certainly he would have had lots of time to be able to go about and do that. And again, they talk about from their perspective that Enochian knowledge was used in conjunction with the gods so that they could build markers for future generations of civilization that was more advanced than what we have today, that was destroyed by the flood. And that's what a lot of these ancient megaliths and things were designed to do. And what's also interesting about Stonehenge is that it seems to be like built on many, what they would call mini dolmens. So you have two rocks standing up and one over top. That would be a dolmen-like structure. And dolmen means portal. And many of the portals are called fairy dolmens. So if you want to Google dolmen, D-O-L-M-A-N, or a fairy dolmen, you'll bring up all of these images of these mini Stonehenge types of things. So it's thought that Stonehenge might have been partly used as a portal, which is, again, a significant part of fairy belief system and part of the occult and the polytheist religions of ancientology. And I'll connect that back to the Middle East and to Gilgal-Rephaim, which is the Wheel of the Giants that's on the Golan Heights. It has hundreds of portal dolmens there as well, and that was the area where that is thought to be one of the most holy places of the Rephaim after the flood. And in the Ugaritic text, the Rephaim would travel back and forth, and somehow using these kinds of portals to the underworld and back to the physical world. So I think it's all connected in both the Nephilim and the Rephaim and the religious system of Enochian mysticism and or the Babel religion, as it's is known in the Bible after Babel.
I have James Rohrback that says it's a bench for the giants, and I think he's being funny. But who knows, right? And we have Electric Pyramid asked the question, are we in a demiurge prison with Christ the only way out of this simulation? Which is interesting because I know of the demiurge belief coming from the like Gnostic. Anyway, go ahead and answer the question. Do you think we are in a demiurge prison with Christ is the only way out of this simulation?
Well, what we don't know is how the physical world was created. But certainly in the cult belief, they believe that this world is just a projection. And the projection is the allegory for the Matrix movies. And that the Gnostics further believe that they have, that the evil God of the Bible enslaves humankind in this physical world, as opposed to the spiritual world where God is in, and forces humans to worship him and keeps them in ignorance, which is why Gnosticism in their belief system, and beginning with the, Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree of gnosis, as they would like to call it, is a cult of knowledge, a religion of knowledge. And that's why in mysticism you're on this quest to learn more so that you can be evolving into gods. And in that concept, there's two pillars of godhood. One is immortality and the other is knowledge. And so they're a cult of knowledge offering godhood. That's their belief system to sort of frame this. So this world wasn't created to be a prison. This world was created so God could create additional life in a long-term plan that included angels, many of which rebelled. And this world was created for humans to who weren't created immortal like angels, who are created mortal and lost access to the tree of life after eating from the tree of good and evil. That's Adam and Eve. And so that we have to choose God with very little knowledge and faith to gain our immortality. So we are not enslaved. We are given opportunities in this gift to be with God in eternity and be part of those names that are written in the book of life created before creation and not rubbed out. Everybody has a choice under the same type of conditions throughout this period of creation of life, so that we can be adopted as brothers by Jesus, to be raised up as high as angels in the future world where angels are going to serve us. So no, it's not quite a prison. This is just a world that the ones who rebelled previous have been trying to destroy humans from achieving their destiny, and by doing so would justify their rebellion and be given a world or a realm of their own, away and free from God. And that's what they sell to their followers, and that's what they'll be selling in the end time when they try and get people to line up against the God of the Bible and fight for your freedom.
Precisely, I agree with that completely. At least there's some knowledge basis I have equal to yours. Yay! I get excited when I know some of these things that I've come to know because of the Lord. I've prayed for truth and wisdom and discernment. I'm so grateful for what He's brought into my life. Okay, so I like Yasin's. We have Yasin in the chat, and he has a question that I like a lot because I wonder this too. Where would you Now, okay, now let me give you reference to why I like this question. Me and friends talk about cities of refuge, that if it might come to end times, we might have to, there might be places of shelter for us to run to while God's, maybe in the tribulation time, just pouring out His wrath. Where do you think, is there a place where you would take shelter that you know of, where you might go?
When I was younger, I used to think that there were places to go, and you can sort of separate yourself from the outside world. As things have progressed, because the end time didn't come as so many people were predicting, by the 80s or the 90s or the 70s or the 2000s or the 2010s, that the technology is advancing at such a rapid pace that there's nowhere to hide. They can find you everywhere. And we're quickly seeing that even before the time that the mark of the beast will be implemented, which is at the midpoint of the last 7 years, that we're very close to having to be on a complete electronic money system. And, COVID is moving that whole agenda up in preparedness for future pandemics. I don't think cash is going to be available. So, yeah, I used to think that there was a place, and I'm kind of in a place where I thought I'm not that far if I have to go a little bit further to be away from the world, but they can track you anywhere, with the technology that they have. And I don't think and you're going to have to be able to hunt and stuff. And again, everything is controlled. So it's going to be increasingly more difficult. I suppose you could store food underneath the earth or something in a bomb shelter and then just live as a mole for 7 years or 10 years if you get the timing wrong, and better have enough food and not show your head until at some point in time down the road. But things have moved to a point where what I thought I could do in preparation, I'm not so sure there's a whole bunch we can do to protect ourselves. And I would also say that my knowledge in Scripture has improved over the decades. And when you understand the birth pangs, and you understand that there's at least two tribulations. You have the affliction or the tribulation that the word affliction comes from, which is thlipsis, as I recall. And it means, and it's translated as affliction and tribulation and persecution and trouble many times in the New Testament. And so when Jesus talks about the affliction just after the birth pangs, he's referring to the first 3.5-year persecution. And then and that's the persecution of the saints that are shown in Revelation 7, as opposed to the persecution of the world, which happens in the last 3.5 years, which is unlike anything seen since the beginning of the world. And that's clearly a different persecution, one of the world, one of the saints. And then we're also told in Revelation 2, 9, and 10 that you have persecution for 10 days for the church of Smyrna, the church of poverty. And if a day is a year, and you have Revelations matching up with Daniel in the last 7 years with the same events, because Daniel matches up very, very well, and the last week of years is 7 years, then that means there could be 3 more years of persecution before the persecution of the first 3.5 years, and then the persecution of the last 3.5 years, and that the seals haven't been opened at that point, and that the seals are opening at that point when this persecution is going on. So the seals, I probably confused people with that comment a little bit. So the seals don't represent the start of the last 7 years. They actually represent beforehand, and if you look at the size of those disasters, I mean, that's absolutely huge. And this is the time between where the birth pangs hit a certain crescendo, and then you have the rise of Babylon and the false prophets prophesying calamities to convert or be wiped from the face of the earth, which will set up the wars and the pandemics and things that will permit the negotiation of the last 7 years. And then you get the second part of that tribulation of Babylon, which is the first 3.5 years, and then you have, hopefully people are raptured by the midpoint or shortly after, and that tribulation is only for those people who weren't raptured and refused to take the mark of the beast. But there's going to be significant persecution then for Israel and Judah as they're being exodus to the promised land by Jesus. But before that, they're going to be put in prisons and things. So you've got all of this persecution that is going on that is going to catch people off guard. And again, the technology is going to be there that we're not probably going to be able to protect ourselves adequately.
Okay. Well, I'm still praying for more time myself, but I have to come to this is the being prepared, not scared portion of it. James Rohrback in the chat wanted to ask about the giant of Kandahar, but he didn't ask what his question was, but he just said, do you know of the giant of Kandahar? And if you do, I'm sure you would be able to explain who that is.
Yeah, there was a red-headed giant that was allegedly captured in Afghanistan probably at least 10 years ago now. And I had a chance to listen to the podcast on Coast to Coast that Steve Quayle was on with a pilot that was there that was giving a description of the account. And this thing was absolutely extraordinary, and the details that the pilot gave were extraordinary. He either had inside knowledge and done extraordinary research, or he was describing accurately what he saw, because the descriptions were extraordinary and very, very similar to what I describe in my book in chapter 4. I mean, it was huge, it was wide. I mean, these things aren't tall and gangly. They are, like that had a horrible smell about it. It had a voice that was, would just rock the earth. It was dexterous. It could move. It was swift, just as the heroes of old were. and killed many of the people that were there, and it took all sorts of weapons and things to bring it down and to kill it. And if I'm remembering right, I mean, they're describing it that it was at least 1,500 pounds or 2,000 pounds, as I recall. So, as I was impressed by the details of it. So, I think we have to be open to the fact that some of these things still exist, and it makes sense that they would hide out in remote areas. Because humans and we were hunting them down and drove them out of the lands that they were. So they're the enemies of humans. So they would destroy us if they had the same opportunity. So I would understand that they would hide out with the few that would be left in places where they wouldn't be disturbed.
That's so
So
interesting.
I thought it was credible, I guess, to me. Yeah.
Yeah, it did sound that way, especially with the way that the story. You're right, like the way the story was told and described, and but if he was eating, if he was cannibalistic, I mean, and that's not cannibalistic because he's not totally human. But I wonder where he'd be getting. I guess maybe he'd come out sometimes and grab people. I just wonder how long they could survive or what kind of diet they've got to be on, and if they're hiding out, I guess they'd just be eating animals underneath the ground. I suppose we could
Yeah.
speculate for hours.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, their appetite would require a lot of hunting, so, or they would have people supplying it with food, but why would people do that? So hard
Right.
to know.
Gosh, we have a few questions, so I just want to pick one that I let me just ask this one because I think we're all kind of wondering, and we've talked about this timeline before, but Yasin had one last question, and I'm sorry to everybody if I didn't get to a really important question that you wanted to ask, but he'll come back. I know he will. But this question was, how much time do we have left? I mean, whether it's before the tribulation starts or the seals are opening, and all, as you said, how much time do we have left?
Usually a bad idea to make predictions like that. I would make an educated guess as opposed to a prediction. I think we've got, at least 10 years. I think there's just a lot of things that are yet to happen, significant things. And so we need to see these birth pangs intensify. And so there's going to have to be some wars, and there's going to have to be some famines, and there's going to have to be some monstrous earthquakes, and there's going to have to be more pandemics. Now, out of war, you get a lot of those things that extend out of war. So, famine and disease would naturally come about it. And if they're doing some sort of nuclear war, you could have, tectonics in place as well. So all of it may be kind of related on that. So we need to see those things intensify so that you get a scenario where a false religion with their false prophets that are coming out can make predictions of doom and have enough time to scare everybody to convert to the true religion that they're going to be proposing. And it's got to be designed to bring down Christianity as we know it, that it would be folded in. It's got to be designed so that it'll fold in Islam into it, and Judaism. And Judaism is going to have to accept that, this Antichrist figure is going to have some Judaic bloodlines, who's going to be the one who negotiates this covenant that protects Israel. So there's going to have to be something that happens that is going to require the world wanting to or feeling a need to protect Israel to bring about peace as well. So all of that to me suggests that, probably at least a decade. Now I know things can move up with, cataclysmic changes. I mean, you could have a nuclear war, or you could have aliens show up on be part of our operating world and changes everybody's sort of point of view and paradigm. But we haven't seen that yet. I know we're moving in that direction, and I know that we're moving quicker, but there's just a lot of things. So I would say educated guess, we've probably got 10 years before we get into that period of the seal opening and the rider coming out on a white horse with a bow and a crown. And I want to tell people that bow is not a weapon of war. That is the word toxin, as I recall, and it means a simple garment, or like a white garment that, the royalty used to wear, or the gods used to wear. And the crown is more of a wreath as you take that back into Greek, and it's depicted as one made from branches. So if you can envision the wreath as being the same wreath that's on the UN symbol or the WHO symbol, that's called a laurel wreath of sheaves, and that's what they used to put on athletes in the ancient Olympic Games who won, and what kings would wear as a special type of crown. That's what he's going to be garnering. So he's going to be coming in a different manner to unite the world based on what's going on in the birth pangs. So we need to view those horses of the apocalypse a little bit differently than what the standard dogma is. And again, I have a 3-part series on the 4 horsemen if people want to get a hold of me, and it'll help explain all of that. Or on Josh Peck's Daily Renegade, I did part 1 on the 4 horsemen this last Sunday, and in another couple of weeks I'll do part 2. I think there'll probably be a part 3 on it as well, if you're a member of that.
What was his name again?
I would say Josh Peck, Daily Renegade.
Yep, write that down, guys. Josh, I'll type it. Go ahead, Doug. We're going to say more.
And my show is called the Christian Contrarian.
Oh, very good. And another question for you then is, people want to get these documents that you've mentioned, they can find you basically through your Genesis 6 website, right? And I have pinned that in the chat at the
yes.
I have put this in the chat for the Genesis 6 conspiracy website. And it's Genesis and number 6 conspiracy.com. Do you have an email, or do you prefer people message through there?
Well, you can message through there. It's the same email. So Genesis6conspiracy@gmail.com.
That's easy. And you are on Facebook as your own real name, unlike myself, who can't because Facebook deleted my accounts previously. So he's on
and
Facebook.
People can get a hold of me at Facebook as well.
Yes, he does answer messages.
Get documents. Yeah. Yes.
Which I appreciate. Gosh, there was something I was going to ask that was related to all that, and then it slipped my mind just at the very last moment. Oh, what I believe and what I tell people is, just because when we talk about how much time we have left, it doesn't mean we're all going to pass away at the beginning of all this, or the things get bad, and it will be hard. I'm not trying to make everybody feel good about this, but do you believe, Gary, that there will be some people that survive beyond the tribulation, because that's when Jesus comes back in the 1,000 years of peace, right?
Yes, there has to be survivors, and survivors all around the world, and those people who will go into the millennium will be people who didn't take the mark of the beast. And amazingly, out of some of those people will be the descendants of Gog and Magog, who will rise up when Satan is released at the end of the 1,000 years. So yes, there will be people survive, and obviously you're going to have a rule of Jesus that will be, pulls apart from what the rules of the fallen angels was like. But yet, when Satan is released at the 1,000 years from the abyss, there's still going to be another war, and they're going to have to. Jesus will take care of them just as he does the ones in the end time at Armageddon, and then we move on to eternity after that. But the enormous patience that God has in letting this play out to ensure all of those that are possible are given the opportunity to gain eternal life is just, to me, extraordinary. As painful as it can be, and impatient for as we are, that we'd like to have things move faster sometimes.
Yes, but that's a great hope to see. If people forget, or they don't want to know about Revelation, they don't want to hear about it from the pulpit, they don't want to talk about it with their friends. And I even have a friend that she says she just can't, I love her because she's coming around to the truth, but she also admits, which is great, that it's just too much for her sometimes. And these kinds of things, sadly, are too much for so many people. But our goal here is to prepare everybody not to scare anybody, and that there is not just hope in possibly even surviving through a tribulation, but death is not a bad thing. Death is a great thing, especially when we have this solid faith in our Savior. We know where we're going, we know who we're going to be with, and we know what it's going to be like. It's described to us, it's clear. And you know that all those spirits of fear, the spirits of anxiety, uncertainty, death, they go away in Jesus' name. And you can live in the peace and joy now that of the kingdom of heaven that was promised to us. And that is what I have come to know. And I'm sure, Gary, you've come to know that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing that always struck me is that we're told in the New Testament that all of those who are saved will go through tribulation, and so we should not expect not to have tribulation. So it's just the degree of that tribulation. And in the West, we've been very, very fortunate. Christians have been persecuted all around the world. It just hasn't come to where we are yet. But we should anticipate that. And that's when we're tested. And that's when we're saved. So I think we should look forward to the end time. Nobody should want to go through what is coming, but what we do know is how the story ends, and that's what we need to have faith in.
Well, Gary, if you don't mind, just one more minute, since we've got one more minute, would you mind if whether you want to close out in prayer or I can close out in prayer? How would you like to do that, or would you mind if we do that?
Yeah, we can do that. Yep. So I can close us out in prayer.
I appreciate it.
So Father in heaven, thank you. Father in heaven, thank you for permitting these types of gatherings and associations so that we can discuss topics that are on people's minds and to hopefully share information and then share that information with other people. And that we all learn in this process to be prepared and to be better in our faith and to better role model how we ought to be, particularly in the times that we are today, so that we can help other people hear your calling to come to you and be saved. And so I want to throw out a prayer of blessings for all of the people who were part of this conversation tonight, and that seeds will be planted from some of the information that was discussed tonight, and further make your word known and about what things are about in the world today and where things are headed. And so we thank you for permitting this, and we thank you for allowing us to have the ability to talk about these things and explain these things and to hopefully raise some curiosity and some interest and some knowledge so that we can help others that are out there. So we thank you for allowing this, and we pray all of these things in the name of our Redeemer, the Word Jesus, who sits at your right-hand side and testifies to you for us and for all of the saints. We also pray in the name of the Holy Spirit, in your great and holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, and I know that you are busy again, which is so great, but I will plan to have you back at some point in the future. And also, if you guys didn't get your questions answered, he does do AMA on Zen Garcia's show, which is Ask Me Anything. So feel free to find him there, and thanks again. We'll see you when you can make it back.
Sure. Sounds good.
All right. Good night, Gary. Be blessed.
Good night.
I don't really wanna jump to conclusions, but I got a feeling the world is living in delusion. Lost and confused are so many of our youth in tune with evolution, so they're missing the truth. With views of atheism and whatever they choose, we knew there'd be division from them breaking the rules. Isn't it sufficient that he gave us the clues? Existing in a visit from the king of the Jews. Refuse to recognize the parallels and views, alluding to the fact that God is not amused when we do not worship him but what we buy and use, pretending to ignore that which our conscience views. Tell our kids they're just like animals and apes and zoos. Then we wonder why our churches have these empty pews. As soon as they believe the knuckle dragging baboons, they can act like animals because they got the excuse. Lock your doors, I'm afraid that there's monkeys on the loose. Assuming this is true, the only thing that counts is you. Bow down, give the golden calf his due. You might as well worship an idol with what you do. You worship what you got, what you bought, and what you do. And why wouldn't you, if all that counts is you? Bow down, give the golden calf his due. You might as well worship an idol with what you do. You worship what you got, what you bought, and what you do. And why wouldn't you, if all that counts is you? What's it gonna take to admit our mistakes? Awaken to the fact that we've all been played. Persuaded to embrace ideas we once were apes. And amoebas are related to the human race. It's amazing that we bought into this whole charade. Made to think that there's no God and we cannot be saved. It's evaded education like a deadly plague, and degraded many minds of any hope enslaved by the sins they are just driven by the rage and shame. Instead of his forgiveness, it's a ball and chain that they carry with them daily like their favorite thing. It's no wonder kids are craving what they should disdain. Is there something in the water, are the drugs to blame? Or is there something deeper that we can't explain? With crazy zombie people who might eat your face, it makes me think that we are living in the last of days. It seems like sin is growing and invading brains. People acting like they're golem with this precious ring. Bow down, give the golden calf his due. You might as well worship an idol with what you do. You worship what you got, what you bought, and what you do. And why wouldn't you, if all that counts is you? Bow down, give the golden calf his due. You might as well worship an idol with what you do. You worship what you got, what you bought, and what you do. And why wouldn't you, if all that counts is you?